humor about their clans, about clans. So that, oh, he must be touchy me. He should touch me.
Okay.
Yeah, that's another color.
Okay, so what about somebody from up north? What if you see somebody from, well, the guy that was just sitting here is from Pine Ridge. Yeah, did he look like a
He looked Navajo.
Lakota? He looked Navajo?
No, I didn't even see him.
Did he look Navajo? So you knew that he wasn't from here? But did you know he was native?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why, because his hair was long? But you didn't know where he was from?
Good idea. I mean, if you're, I guess, familiar with a certain tribe or a certain group of people, it
There
would
you
be
go.
easier for you to.
The more that you've seen them,
The more you've seen them, the more you've interacted.
I guess
with
that's
them.
logical.
You wouldn't assume, but you would already know, versus never having any contact, you would just assume.
Right. So if you're in Gallup and you're wandering around Walmart and you see somebody, you look at them and say, well, they're probably Navajo. They look Navajo to me.
Yeah, and then they might speak a different language, like Pueblo or any language, and you go, oh, never mind. they're
Never,
Pueblo.
yeah, I'm
There's
wrong.
me.
I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I guess we all
Um,
do look the same.
All Indians look the same. All Asians look alike, right? No, they don't. No, you can usually tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. And I talk about this from time to time. Koreans have rectangular faces. Chinese have round faces. Japanese have triangular faces. Vietnamese are skinny little people.
I actually met a person from Pine Ridge over the weekend.
Is that right? Maybe it was this guy, because he's from
No,
Pine.
it was a lady.
Oh, a lady,
She
okay.
was a
Did she look different? Could you tell she was a Navajo?
little bit.
Okay,
She was dancing to the hoop and the hoop dancing
okay.
at a film festival. So she performed.
There you go. Okay. So last time I was talking about white people, how you identify white people. I also talked about how you identify how black people identify each other. So when we're talking about natives wandering around the southwest or the northwest or the northeast or wherever they are, identifying different tribes, they usually identified them by their clothes, right? Okay, so let's imagine we're in Europe and we've got different groups of white people. How in the world are they going to identify each other? How are they going to tell if this is a friendly guy or an enemy? Do you remember how we identified white people to begin with? According to this book? Their hair, okay. So if you're around Vikings, what color are their hair?
Blonde.
Blonde, so they're probably blonde. If you're around Italians, they probably have what color hair? Black, yeah, probably black hair. Okay, so if you're around the Brits, who are Celts and Angles and Saxons and all kinds of strange people, what color is their hair probably? If you go to England, what color hair are you going to run into more than any other?
Red.
Gray?
Red.
Oh, good. They're all old farts. Red hair, maybe in Scotland, but certainly not. Oh, wait a minute, there you go. So you see somebody with red hair, you know that they're probably, or Irish. Okay. But you see somebody from England, and what color is their hair? Blonde is for Vikings. That's them people up way up north. Farther up north you go, the paler their skin and the lighter colored their hair. Of course, red people have people with red hair. Red people with red hair have the palest skin. Have the palest skin. People from England have brown hair. People from France have brown hair. People from Germany have blonde hair if they're from the north because of the influence of the Vikings. Okay. So when we're talking about identifying white people, it's logical to identify them by their hair color because that's the way white people identified each other. They looked at their hair color. They could tell if the guy had yellow hair or really light colored hair. Potentially they were Vikings. They were somebody from way up north. And those people were really dangerous. They were far more dangerous than just about anybody else. The Vikings actually conquered France at one point. A group of Vikings conquered France, this huge country. They went up the Seine River and they captured Paris, and they burned it to the ground. And so the King of France decided that he was going to keep this from happening again. He didn't want any more Vikings coming up. So he made a deal with the Viking king. He said, I'll give you land if you settle at the mouth of the Seine, so that other Vikings can't come up the river. That's what he said. And that's what he did. And those people became the Normans, because they were Northmen. You got a chair right there, I know. I don't know how this worked. It looks like somebody's been stealing chairs. You got the best one.
I know, I like it.
That's Johnny's chair. If he comes, you have to give it. Oh, man. Okay, so all of this is logical, isn't it? When a native sees another native, how do they identify themselves? They identify themselves, in the old days, they identified them by their clothes, by maybe their hairdo, by whatever, because everybody looks pretty much alike, right? Natives?
Now
So
we
you-
go by Casino Jeffries.
There you go. Which casino did they go to last? Okay. So that's the way you used to do it. They used to identify which tribes they were dealing with. If you ever watch old cowboy movies, they look at the arrow and they look at the feather to try to determine which group made that arrow as to who was shooting who. And white people, of course, were dealing with different groups of individuals. And I'm not really talking about interbreeding, but what I'm talking about is most of the people from this area have brown hair. Most of the people from this area have blonde hair, have red hair, have black hair. And because of that, that's how white people identify themselves, through their hair color. Now, what about down in Africa? Are all Africans the same skin tone?
Aren't some darker and some lighter than others?
Exactly. So if you see somebody coming toward you, and you want to know if they're hostile toward you, you have to read their skin tone to determine what group they come from. So all of this is very, very logical, identifying people. So when we look at a select individual, we have to identify them by the way that group of individuals identifies themselves. With African Americans, with Africans, with people with African Americans, it's skin tone. With white people, it's hair color. And with natives, you guys aren't exactly sure how to identify them by their casino jacket. Okay. Okay, so all of this makes a lot of sense. And of course, we're talking about people being able to identify a select individual that potentially robbed them or raped them or did something to them. So if it was a white person, you identify them by their hair color. If it's someone with African ancestry, you do it by their skin tone. And if it's a native, you do it by their jacket, casino jacket. Okay, thanks, Brian. I needed that information. In a cognitive interview. Okay, so now it's the police talking to an individual that has seen a crime. They are an eyewitness. In a cognitive interview, the interviewer establishes a rapport with the witness, then asks the witness to provide a narrative account of the event, and finally probes for details with specific questions. It's not a question and answer situation per se. They want a narrative from that select individual. They want them to give them information in their own words. Because if they give them information in their own words, then of course it's potentially going to be more accurate. If the guy is forcing them to say things that they don't want to say, then of course they're not going to get very good information. So the individual needs to establish a rapport with the select individual. They need to get them to give them a narrative account, and then if there are any questions at the end, then they need to use probing specific questions. What was he wearing? What did he look like? How tall was he? I mean, if they didn't get that information initially, of course, now they're going to have to query that select individual. But initially, of course, they just allow the person to give them a narrative, to talk to them. Okay. The interviewer also allows the witness to direct the subject matter and the flow of questioning. They interrupt infrequently and they listen actively to the witness's responses. Active listening means that you're not only taking in everything they're saying, but you're also looking at the way that they are reacting to this information. You can tell if it's good information or if it's a lie by the way that they're giving you the information. The interviewer may cue a witness to mentally reconstruct the physical and emotional experiences that existed at the time of the crime. They need to know how they were feeling at the time so that they can get good information, so that they can determine how lucid they were when all of this was taking place. If they were screaming and crying and they had tears in their eyes, how well are they going to be able to identify what somebody looked like if their eyes are full of tears? It clouds your vision. It makes your vision very poor. So they need to understand exactly how they experienced the crime, because potentially the information that they're getting isn't very good. If they're talking about what their hair color was, what their face looked like, what their outfit looked like, through a veil of tears, everything is fairly dark. And of course, that's going to change the individual that they're looking for. The interviewer may direct the witness to form an image of the situation, recollect sights, recollect sounds and smells and physical conditions. What did the individual look like? There was a rapist in California once upon a time who had horrible, horrible breath. Just terrible breath. And he's the hillside strangler. So he'd go into people's houses, and if he didn't kill them, he did kill a number of women, but if he didn't kill them, they always complained about this guy's breath. Well, the reason he had bad breath was because he had bad teeth. He had all kinds of interesting problems with his teeth. And that's how they caught him, because they were looking for somebody with bad breath, and that's eventually how they caught him. How hot was it? How cold was it? How dark was it? They need to recall any emotional reactions experienced at the time, because they need to understand how accurate the information that they're getting is. So they need to know all of this information. They need to know how spooked this lady was, how freaked out she was, how emotional she was. Potentially, if something bad is happening to you, you don't want to see it. So people will look away. And of course, if she's looking away the entire time that something is taking place, then potentially she doesn't have very good information. If the individual has a weapon, one of the things that people will do is they don't want to be killed. So they don't want to look directly at the individual so that they can't identify them. They think if they don't see you, it's kind of like a child hiding and covering their eyes and hiding. It's the same situation. They're trying to protect their own psyche. When the witness has mentally reconstructed the event, the interviewer asks for a detailed narrative and then uses follow-up questions to probe for specific information. Witnesses are sometimes asked to recall events in different temporal orders, describing the event from the end to the beginning, from different perspectives, or from the point of view of different people. And of course, this is very difficult trying to be somebody else. Well, if you weren't the person that you are, how would you describe what had happened to you? The reason they're doing this is because they're looking for specific pieces of information. So instead of just going from point A to point C, they will start at point B and go to point C and then go back to point A, hoping that they will jog their memory in one way or another to bring out new information. The cognitive interview has been shown to generate substantial increases in correct recall, though it can also produce a small increase in incorrect details. A lot of times they're trying to be, if the individual is looking for specific information, they want to give you that specific information. And a lot of times it's inaccurate or incorrect, and they know it's not correct. Usually they do. They're trying to reconstruct in their own mind what happened. A lot of times it is There are blank spots. It's like blinking. What happened when you had your eyes closed? Well, I don't know. I couldn't see what was going on. And of course, they will close their eyes for a select amount of time. But then they will ask them to reconstruct the information that they don't actually have. And of course, when they do that, some of the details are incorrect. And this is a problem. This can potentially be a problem. An investigator should instruct the witness that the offender may or may not be present. We're talking about lineup instructions. So that they don't just identify the person that looks the closest to the individual that they're looking for the perpetrator. If you're looking at this group of individuals, everybody looks different. Some are tall, some are short, some are old. Some are tattooed, some are businessmen. Of course, they should understand that the individual may or may not be there in the lineup. In a traditional lineup, all the lineup members are shown to the witness at once, and this is known as simultaneous presentation, where everybody is standing there. An alternative is to show lineup members sequentially, and this is known as a sequential presentation. This is number one, and then they show the one individual, they walk out of the room, and then number two comes in, and they look at number two. The witness may make a decision about each lineup member before seeing the next. Of course, they will decide that's not him, that's not him, that's not him. So it's a little bit easier with a sequential presentation than it is with a simultaneous presentation. When you look at a group of individuals, you're looking for a specific facial structure, you're looking for maybe a specific hairdo. If someone has a similar facial structure or a similar hairdo, then of course they may misidentify the individual that's in the lineup. The manner in which a lineup is presented can affect the accuracy of identification. In general, sequential lineups result in fewer identification attempts, so both mistaken and accurate identifications are reduced. So the problem with sequential presentations is that you don't get as many accusations. Not only does it decrease the number of mistaken identifications, but also the number of accurate identifications, as confusing as that may be. Why are there more mistaken identifications in a simultaneous lineup? In a simultaneous lineup presentation, eyewitnesses tend to identify the person who looks the most like the culprit relative to other members of the group, and this is known as relative judgment. So if you have a mass of people, you're looking for somebody that looks like Sheldon, who just walked out of the room. So we're looking for the person that's closest to Sheldon, and of course the person in this room that looks the closest to Sheldon has to be Johnny, because he also has a single braid going back down the back of his head. So if we were misidentifying Sheldon, of course, we may identify Johnny because his hair is very similar to Sheldon's, or more similar than anybody else's hair in the room. As long as the perpetrator is in the lineup, the relative judgment process works very well. But of course, the perpetrator needs to be in the lineup in order for that to be accurate, as sad and strange as that is. But if the actual culprit is not shown, a positive identification may still occur because someone in the group will always look most like the culprit. In the old days, people wore a lot of clothes. All men wore hats. So they would always have the men wear hats, especially if a man that attacked them had been wearing a hat. So they would have them wear a hat. The problem is, of course, what if somebody's wearing a hat very similar to them? How do we identify people? How does my grandson identify the kids in his kindergarten class? Some of his friends are Green Bay Packers. Some of his friends are Dallas Cowboys. Some of his friends are no Cardinals. Sorry about that, Johnny. No Cardinals fans in Iowa. Some of them are bears, some of them are green, some of them are red, some of them are yellow. Why? Because it all depends on what they're wearing. It all depends on, if they're really good friends, he knows what their favorite team is. Now the question is, what is his favorite team? His dad's favorite team is the Miami Dolphins. But all of a sudden, his favorite team are the Green Bay Packers. I have no idea what happened. If maybe his best friend is a Green Bay Packer fan, we have no idea. But all of a sudden, everything is green and yellow as far as my grandson is concerned. The reality is we all do the same thing. We identify people by what they're wearing. So you guys all have to wear the same clothes, or I won't have a clue who you are every day. So wear that damn sweatshirt every day, Joe. Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. In a sequential lineup, the eyewitness compares each member in turn to his or her memory of the perpetrator, and on that basis decides whether any person in the lineup is the individual who committed the crime, and this is known as an absolute judgment. So they're being forced to find somebody, and that somebody may not be there. And this is known as absolute judgment. Maybe they got a incomplete look at the person. Maybe they only saw one side of the person's face. Maybe they only saw them from the back and from the side. So they saw one ear and the hat that they were wearing and the back of their neck. Can you identify somebody with that image? It's possible to do it, but of course we're asking them for an absolute identification. The lineup is typically conducted by the detective who selected the killers and knows which person is the suspect. A lineup administrator's knowledge of the suspect's identity can increase the likelihood that an eyewitness will choose someone more likely than the administrator has failed to provide instructions that the suspect may not be in the lineup. And that's really what they need to tell them. They may or may not be here. How good is their eyewitness account anyway? How much information do they have as far as the suspect is concerned? And the answer may be not very much information. The reality is that none of us are professional. Well, some of us are. Yeah, none of us are professional observers. So you only have the information that you have. He looked like Jay-Z. Wait a minute. Jay-Z is a rapper, right? And he was on television on Saturday Night Live. Okay. So he looked like Jay-Z, but it couldn't have been Jay-Z. He was in New York. So it's somebody that looks like Jay-Z, right? So I need to find people that look like Jay-Z. So that's a value judgment on my part, finding people that look like Jay-Z and determine who the culprit is. Ideally, the lineup should be administered by someone who does not know which person is the suspect. What will happen when they call somebody in and they line up all the people? Of course, it's a one-way mirror, so the people that are in the lineup can actually see the individual that is accusing them. What will happen is, if I know who the suspect is, that's who I'm going to be looking at. And I'm going to say, well, you need to look at each one in turn. Number one, step out and do whatever you want them to do. Number two, step out and do whatever you want them to do. Number three, step out and do whatever. So in your voice inflection, you're telling the individual which is the suspect, unfortunately. So the best way to administer one of these things is for somebody that has no clue which one is the suspect. That's the best way to do it. They had a horse that could count. He could do math. And nobody could figure out how this horse must be brilliant. This horse can do calculus. What the hell's going on here? How can a horse do this? And as it turned out, the individual that was controlling the horse, his trainer, he had different inflections in his voice. And he didn't realize it. He thought the horse was brilliant. And all the horse was doing was he was reacting to his trainer. And of course, when the trainer said something, the way he said it told the horse how many times to paw the ground. As strange as that may seem. But we do this all the time. We do. We have different inflections in our voices, and it tells people, gives people information. Eyewitnesses sometimes express increased certainty in their identification as a result. As a result of events that happen after they choose someone from the lineup. For example, if eyewitnesses receive confirmation feedback from the lineup administrator, of course, then they're going to react to that. Confidence expressed by eyewitnesses is one of the most compelling reasons why jurors believe such identifications are accurate. She didn't get to look at all 18,000 people in town to determine which one was her rapist. She got to look at 10, and she picked the guy out of the lineup. And he was the closest person that she could find. Now we know how white people identify other white people. They look at their hair. They look at their hair tone. We know how African Americans identify other African Americans. They look at their skin tone. So if her rapist was a white guy, she's looking at his skin tone. Well, all white people have about the same skin tone, don't they? Pretty damn close. Unless they're really pale. Okay. So she's going to misidentify who he is. Potentially she is. Because the way that white people identify each other is by their hair color. But the way African Americans identify each other is by skin tone. I was watching Jones, the Free Country of Jones, or something. It's about the Civil War. I don't know, it's just on television last night. It's got Matthew McConaughey in it, and he's a Confederate, and he decides he doesn't want to be part of the Confederacy. So he deserts. He's in the Confederate Army. He deserts, and he starts a war against the Confederates because they won't leave him alone, and they won't leave the people in his area alone. So he actually frees select counties in Mississippi, and he marries an African American woman, which is kind of interesting. Because that's against the law. It was against the law before the war. It actually is against the law after the war as well. And that's what the movie's all about, is white people marrying black people. But the interesting thing was the lady's skin tone. Because she was a mulatto. In other words, she was not full-blooded African-American, black. She was part white. Because of that, her skin tone is fairly pale. So some people confused her for they confused her as a white lady, but of course her skin tone was very pale. And as a black person, of course, they would identify her by her skin tone. But as far as the white people were concerned, they saw that she had some Negroid features, so they identified her as a black person, despite the fact she was relatively pale. So her skin wasn't the right. It wasn't the fact that her skin was a different tone. As far as the African Americans were concerned, it was the fact that her skin was a different tone. It was the fact that her hair was a different texture and a different color. It was darker. And for that reason, of course, they identified her as black. Studies have shown that witness confidence is not a very good predictor of a witness's accuracy unless it is measured immediately after an identification. Asking witnesses to provide a statement of their degree of certainty before giving them any feedback can be an effective way to eliminate the problem of false confidence. So you need to find out how confident they are as to the identification that they have made. As time goes by, they will convince themselves that despite the fact they made a misidentification, that identification is correct as time goes by. Because they were playing it over and over again in their mind. They see the guy's face better now because they've seen it in a lineup. So they will put that face on their perpetrator's face. So as far as their memory is concerned, they are replacing a piece of memory with a new piece of memory. And now all of a sudden they are definite that they are sure that this is the individual that was the one that attacked them, the perpetrator. Jurors put a great deal of weight on testimony from an eyewitness. Loftus in 1974 gave subjects a description of the armed robbery resulting in 2 deaths. 18% of those presented with only circumstantial evidence against the defendant convicted him. 72% convicted him when eyewitness ID was presented to them. Okay, so if there is an eyewitness, you always trust the eyewitness. You don't always, but jurors almost always believe what the eyewitness said, even though we have proven that they can have, that mistaken identity is very common, especially if the two people are from different groups, are from different races. We already know that that's a problem because they identify each other differently. In the movie last night, all the white guys had beards. It was such a modern movie because everybody had these long beards. I haven't figured out the whole beard thing. I am so confused. Jurors have a baseline expectation that eyewitnesses are accurate. And this is a question. This is an answer to a question on the test, which I finished on Saturday. I don't know if you guys got the message. Yeah, I know. Okay, so midterm someday, isn't it? It's not this week, but next week. Next week. Anyway, this is an answer to one of the questions. They almost always think that they're accurate. Jurors assume that eyewitnesses' testimony is a reflection of their memory quality and not the way that they were questioned or interacted with the lineup administrator. But the reality may be, of course, that there are a lot of different factors that have to do with why they identified this select individual. They may have been pressured to do it by the administrator. And in time, of course, they are taking this face that they can see very plainly in perfect light, and they're putting that on their perpetrator's face. It may be completely inaccurate, but jurors aren't going to read that. They're not going to see that. They think that it's almost always accurate. Jurors over-rely on an eyewitness confidence when gauging accuracy. How sure are you that this is the individual that you saw commit the crime? How positive are you? Are you 100%? Are you 95%? Are you 90%? This is a defense attorney, of course, is asking this question. And probably they'll get 100%. I'm 100% sure that this is it, even if it's inaccurate. Because as time has gone by, and they have seen this face, and they remember this face, all of a sudden they superimpose that face on the perpetrator's face. And now they're 100% sure that that's the bad guy. The other thing that may happen is the police may give them information they really shouldn't be giving them. Like we caught him, 2 blocks away from the scene 5 minutes after the robbery. They may give them information that they really shouldn't have given them. And now they think that they're 100% accurate. Jurors could be informed about whether investigators follow the Department of Justice guidelines for conducting lineups. Eyewitness testimony could be limited. They should allow psychologists who are knowledgeable about the research on perception and memory to testify. And usually that doesn't happen. When I was in Vancouver at the conference, one of our presenters was an individual that is trying to discount eyewitness accounts, because as we know, 80% of all the people that are freed by that group that looks at old cases, 80% of them were convicted by eyewitnesses, and the eyewitnesses were inaccurate. And of course, we do research on eyewitnesses all the time. And what we determine is that eyewitnesses are rarely 100% accurate. It happens very rarely. Well, what if it's good in 85% of the cases? Is that enough? Or 90% of the cases? Or 95% of the cases? We still have 5% of the cases where eyewitnesses are misidentifying the wrong individual. especially if that individual, if the person identifying them as one race and the person they're identifying is another race. Lots of bad identification. Everybody knows that all white people look alike, and all black people look alike, all natives look alike, and all Asians look alike. Everybody knows that. Of course they don't. But we don't think in that direction. If you live on this reservation and you hardly ever see any white people except me, I mean, all white people look like me. They're all kind of short. They've got gray hair, they're balding in the back. I looked at the back of my head over the weekend. I'm so depressed now. I shouldn't look at my hair. So if you only see natives, if you only see people from this reservation, what do other people look like? What do black people look like? What do white people look like? Of course, you get to see them on television, right? You get to see pretty people on television. You get to see ugly white people on television, do you? Not very many. Well, maybe there are, but there are maybe not that many. Do you get to see ugly black people on television? You get to see black people on television. So what do you know about black people and white people if you live here and don't ever go off the reservation? Not a whole hell of a lot, do you? What about people from Cambodia? You know what they look like?
Cambodian?
They do. They look exactly like Cambodians, and they all look alike. It's so amazing. I know. Or Vietnamese. I had a guy that, I'm not going to tell that story. Anyway, well, he shot somebody, and he said he could tell the difference between a good Vietnamese and a bad Vietnamese by the shape of their faces. My God. And he blew that person away, and he had no proof that this was a bad guy or a good guy. He just shot him. Because you could tell by the shape of his face that he was a bad guy. The expert's task is to provide the jury with a scientifically based frame of reference within which to evaluate the eyewitness's evidence. They do not tell the jury what to believe about a particular eyewitness or whether the eyewitness is accurate. This is the expert testimony. Expert testimony tends to sensitize jurors to problems in witnessing and identification procedures. So the expert witness, of course, is hired either by the defense or the prosecution. And usually if the prosecution has an eyewitness, has an expert witness, then the defense will have an expert witness to rebut what the prosecution's expert witness has said. 1976, the wealthy Hannigans caught three illegal Mexican aliens on their property. What do you do with Mexican aliens? They were right on the border of Mexico. So they caught three illegals sneaking across their property. Guess what happened next? What happened to those three guys? Well, what happened was that they tortured them and then they chased them back across the border. Is that legal in the United States? We just like go around torturing? I mean, they weren't citizens of the United States, so obviously we can do whatever the hell we want to with them, right? Is that the way it works? It's not? We can't? Well, this is in 1976. They were tried in the same court. They tried the brothers Patrick and Thomas, and they were given simultaneous trials. Thomas was allowed an expert witness. Patrick was convicted and Thomas was acquitted. Of course, Thomas had the expert witness, and because of his expert witness, he was acquitted, but Patrick was convicted. And these are actually the three aliens. I found a picture of the three aliens. So these are the three Mexican aliens. They had to go down into Mexico to find them, of course, because, well, they're good people. They stayed down in Mexico, especially after they'd been tortured when they came across the border. One of them wouldn't come back. He refused to come back, scared to come back. And I think it was the tall guy, if I'm not mistaken. But eventually, of course, somebody went down there and got his testimony, down into Mexico, and got his testimony. The defense sometimes requests that jurors be altered to the limitations of eyewitnesses. The judge decides whether to grant the request. What effects do cautionary instructions have on jurors' beliefs and eyewitness accuracy? The Telfair instruction reduced mock jurors' sensitivity to eyewitness evidence, probably because that instruction gives little indication how jurors should evaluate the evidence. Okay, so what we have done here is now the judge is, according to federal law, the judge has to tell the jury that eyewitness accounts are not always accurate. That's what they have to tell them. How he tells them is his own, it's not a statement that he reads, and it's always the same. It's different from state to state. In some states, he can say whatever he wants. In other states, he has to go by a select script. And of course, they've tried this out in mock trials, and what they've discovered is it all depends on how he says it, as to how much credence they give to what he says. These findings provide some hints about the type of jury instruction that could reduce the likelihood of mistaken convictions in eyewitness cases. Those instructions, as yet untested, are likely to be issue-specific, tailored to the facts present in a particular case, and based on scientific research findings. And the research says that not all eyewitness accounts are accurate. Eyewitnesses are sometimes mistaken, and especially if there is a difference between the race of one individual and the race of another individual, the person that's identifying. Children over the age of 6 can make reasonably reliable identifications from lineups, provided that the perpetrator is actually in the lineup and the child had extended contact with the perpetrator. They can usually pick them out. That's over the age of 6. That's not under the age of 6. Why? What's going on with babies, with toddlers, with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds? They can talk. What's going on? They're crazy? They're crazy?
Their cognitive mind's not fully developed.
Exactly. They're not completely developed. These are the kids that have a toy that actually talks to them. And that's okay. That's perfectly normal. But, of course, you wouldn't want Calvin to be a witness when he has Hobbs, that tiger, that toy tiger, that sometimes blows up into a real tiger, and he has conversations with. You wouldn't want him testifying in anything. Because he's got such a good imagination. We don't want the tiger to testify either. We don't want Hobbs to testify either. Right, because they're not mature enough, actually. Thanks, Johnny. I didn't even think about that. I'm dying up here. He's probably turning it up, so. To see if he can cook me out of here. I'm a nice guy. Children are generally less accurate than adults when making an identification from a lineup in which the suspect is absent. They pick someone else. For example, they make a false positive error, mainly because they're looking for somebody that looks the most like a select individual. Remember, kids don't always make eye contact. They're not always looking at the same thing adults are. Adults are trying to read a face so that they can remember it later. Children aren't doing this yet. They haven't learned this aspect. So children aren't really studying people's faces so that they can identify them later on. Or they're looking at something specific. Say the guy's got a mole on his right cheek. That's what they focus on. And then they'll say it right out in front of them. Oh, look at the guy's big booger on his face. Yeah. What is that thing? You know, he's screaming at his mother, trying to figure out why this guy has a thing on his face. Anyway, so he's focusing on a specific thing, and potentially he's not really identifying the individual because he doesn't have to worry about this. These are children. They don't have to worry about identifying somebody later on. They identify people by all kinds of interesting things, like what they smell like. If you think about your childhood, you may have had an aunt or a grandmother that had a specific perfume or something about her, and every time she came over, she smelled like whatever. She smelled like that horrible gardenia perfume. Makes you want to vomit. I had an aunt that was such a OCD. She was so OCD that she kept plastic on all of her furniture. and she had plastic runners running up and down her rugs. She didn't want anybody to step on her rugs. What's rug for anyway? Not to step on, obviously. It's to show off to other individuals. She was so nutty about this stuff that her whole house smelled like biscuit. It smelled like plastic, like thick plastic. And she smelled like thick plastic. So to this day, whenever I think of my aunt, I always think of plastic, because she smelled just like plastic. Anyway. And I don't know if I could paint a picture of her, except that she was OCD and had all this plastic stuff all over her house. It was horrible too, because you'd go to her house and she had all these things. She had knickknacks sitting all over the place. And she wouldn't let you touch them because, well, they were off the plastic and you... But here I am, I'm, 4 and 5 and 6 years old and just the wildest kid the world has ever created. And I wanted to play with those damn toys. And I thought they were toys. They're not toys at all. They were things she was showing off to the people that came to her house. Not to me, of course, because I'm only 6 years old. Anyway. Possible solutions, giving children the option to say not sure. Is this the man that attacked you? You need to give them that option. You really don't give that option to adults, but you don't have to, because adults are always trying to make decisions in their own mind. But with kids, of course, they're not always focused on the same thing that adults focus on. Instructions informing them of the importance of making a correct decision decrease guessing and the incidence of false identifications. So if you force them to make an identification, they're going to give you whatever you want. And that, of course, will be inaccurate. But you can't do that. You can't force them to do anything. There is a specific way to interrogate a child. And it takes a long, long time. And they usually will record it to make sure that you haven't guided this child into an identification. But there's a specific way that you do it. And it's fascinating. But it takes a really, really long time, because you have to allow them to give you the information without asking them any leading questions. With an adult, of course, you can ask them what isn't a leading question to a child is not a leading question to an adult, because an adult has their own mind, and of course they can determine whether they're going to, what kind of information they're going to give you, but a child certainly can't do that. Most children's sexual abuse cases rest solely on the words of the victim, because these cases typically lack physical evidence. There's hardly any evidence, usually. Sometimes we can check the area to find out if there has been any damage to the area. If there is, of course, we can identify that sexual abuse has taken place.
What about medical records, like for the child?
I'm sorry?
Like the medical records, like they come into the ER and they go to different ERs because they've been to that one too many times?
Well, if a child comes in and they've got a vaginal rash or something, and it looks like they've been molested, then it's the job of the emergency room, the medical personnel, to turn that in, and they will usually, almost always. Yeah, this really pisses people off. So, this is one of those things that it's not one of those gray areas. This is a black and white area, and it really upsets people, especially nurses. It really upsets nurses. So if the doctor's going, well, I'm not really sure if that's what's going on, the nurse is going to rip him a new tail. Is what's going to happen. I almost said something else that I did. Anyway, yeah. So usually this is what takes place if the child has a sexually transmitted disease. We used to see this all the time. Individuals, children coming in, 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds coming in with gonorrhea. And you're going, that ain't right. And you're really upset. So you want to go out and, beat somebody up, but it's not always who you think it is. Sometimes it's Uncle George or something. Whoops. There are concerns about whether children can be trusted to provide accurate details and disclose experiences of abuse. And this is really kind of a serious problem, Because normally when somebody abuses a child, especially sexually abuses a child, it becomes the secret between them and their abuser. And because of that, it's very hard to get information from them. They have promised this individual that they will not disclose this information. Yeah, so that's a tough one. That gets to be a tough one. You probably don't have any DNA evidence? Yes, ma'am.
What if, like you're saying, it's a secret between just the two of them. What if the child decides to tell about it later on and they grow up? What then?
Okay. That happens.
Yeah, so like how accurate would that be?
How accurate would that
Yeah.
information be? If they've carried this around for 10 or 15 years, then it's probably fairly accurate.
Is there statute of limitations for that too, whenever it comes to this kind of situation?
It all depends on the state.
Okay.
It all depends
And
on.
then what if the perpetrator was also a child too?
What happens if perpetrated as a child as well? That it all depends on the state, on whether they can be prosecuted. I think I told you about the case of my second wife. She was being molested by her brother. Her brother was 14. She was, I don't know, 6 or 7. And he molested her until she was 14. Thinking, of course, that she was protecting her younger sisters, which she wasn't. As it turned out, she wasn't. Nothing ever happened with that case. Okay. Because the statutes of limitations had run out in that state. Of course, it had taken place in Georgia. Yeah, okay. So nothing happened. Nothing happened because of it. Except it turned out that he had molested all of the female children. And so they kind of shunned him out of the family. Okay. That's all that happened with that. Really tragic situation. I could, the rest of the story is really pretty damn ugly, so. She had a really interesting problem. So what's happening here?
Right here, I can-
So we don't know if they can give us good information, especially a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old. Is this a dream they had? Is this real information? Do we have proof that this has happened? It's just an accusation doesn't really mean a whole lot unless we can back it up with something else. We need to back it up with something else. We also need to go to the family and determine, we don't want this to happen anymore, if it is happening. So we need to determine if this is happening. One of the problems is, what if it's the husband, the father, what's going to happen next? Well, if the mother's not really happy with the guy, she'll kick the guy out, usually. But what happens if she's madly in love with him and she's somewhat codependent on him? She's going to defend the father over the child. She's going to say that the child has lied. And we get this all the time, unfortunately. Or what if it's the boyfriend? Is she going to defend the boyfriend over her own daughter? And the answer is, a lot of times that's exactly what happens. She's afraid of not having somebody to love. No. She's afraid of not having somebody who loves her. And she's willing to sacrifice her. Well, and this kind of stuff happens all the time. First, build rapport. So when we're talking to a child, the first thing that you need to do is build rapport with the individual, and then encourage the children to provide details in their own words. You need to use their words. And of course, they don't have words for these because mom told them not to touch that area. Mom told them not to talk about that area. So they don't have any words for vagina. And they don't have any words for oral sex. And they don't have any words for penis. They don't have any words for this stuff because they've tried to stay away from this. After this, investigators may ask specific questions about the event, although children are less accurate with specific questions. A lot of times we have a situation where the child is traumatized, or the child has been told this is what the reaction is. So the child does not have very much accurate or specific information. This is where the whole concept of split personality comes from. The child will create a different personality in their minds so that they can inhabit that personality so that the trauma is not as traumatic. It's not as serious. And this is where dissociative identity disorder comes from. The whole concept of split personality can come out of this. Is split personality common? No, it's not, but it does happen. So it may be that you know that the abuse is taking place, but you can't get any information about it. The child will not give you any information. You have proof, but the child won't or can't give you any information. They've repressed those thoughts. They don't want to think about that, so they won't. And if they don't want to think about it, they certainly won't talk about it. So you need to use a structured protocol, and usually this takes a while. This takes a number of hours to question the child. You're not really questioning them. You're hoping that they will give you the information without you probing. Because if you start probing, if you probe too deeply, if you probe too hard, then what will happen is it will become guided, and if it's guided, it doesn't count. It doesn't count, and of course it may potentially be inaccurate information. The structured protocol discourages the use of suggestive questions. In other words, he touched you, didn't he? You know, that would of course be a leading question, a suggestive question. And you have to stay away from these types of questions. Really hard subject to talk about. Really tough. Almost everybody is upset with pedophiles. And of course, that's what we're talking about here. Children are less accurate with specific versus general questions because specific questions ask for memories of events that the child may never have encoded or may have forgotten. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we stay away from specific questions. The child may answer a question that she or he does not fully understand in order to be cooperative. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to be cooperative with an adult. So they will give you whatever you want if they know what you want. And this is one of the reasons why you can't use leading questions. You can't use suggestive questions because they will tell you anything that you want. If there were a 4-year-old in the room right now, I could question this individual and I could get the individual to agree that they had been molested. Mainly because of the questions I asked. And all they would have to do is would answer yes and no. If that's all they have to give you is a yes or no answer, they're going to give you yes as much as possible. Because they want to be cooperative. You're an adult, so they want to be cooperative. Specific questions can easily become suggestive, and of course that's the problem with suggestive questions. And that's why we don't do them, that's why we don't use them. A sizable number of children experience multiple incidents of sexual abuse. You're talking about, so you may think that you're talking about a specific incident, but in reality, this may have happened to the child over and over and over again. They remember little pieces from each incident, from select incidences. They can't remember dates. They don't know what day it was or what day it is. So you really have no way of pinning down time as far as children are concerned. With some adults, you have no way of pinning down time. If you've got a homeless man that's living in a box in Gallup, what does he care whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday? The only thing that he may remember is what day did all the people come in with money. So that was potentially a Friday when people come and cash their checks in Gallup. And that's when he's more likely to get money. But other than that, what difference does it make? He can remember what time it is, but as far as the sun was concerned, it was almost sundown on sometime a couple months ago. But he can't remember specific days because he doesn't have any sense of reference. Children are the same way. They have no concept of time, not nearly as much. Unless they're going to school, of course, then they know what day Monday is because that's the day they have to start school. And they know what the weekend is because Friday night they get pizza and then Saturday and Sunday they don't have to go to school. But if this is a child that doesn't go to school, he has no point of reference as far as time is concerned. Most parents don't give their children watches, 4-year-old wearing a Rolex. Sometimes they have cell phones, but I don't know. I don't use my cell phone to tell time. I guess I'm kind of like a little kid. It's 11:33.
Why would you flip phone?
What an odd thing to do. You look at your cell phone to tell what time it is. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Okay. Sizable number of children experience multiple incidences. Repeated events enhance memory for aspects of the incident that are held constant but impair the ability to recall details that vary. Prosecutors must provide evidence that reflect details of separate incidents in order to file multiple charges on the child. Usually it has to do with sodomy and rape. So how frequently did he do this? How frequently did he do that? If they're going to charge him with more than one thing. I won't go into the Air Force, okay. If they experience multiple incidences of maltreatment, children may be subjected to repeated interviews, of course. Research has shown both negative and positive effects of repeated interviews on the children's memory and suggestibility. And this is kind of a problem. So you're forcing this child to think about all the negative things that happen to them over and over and over and over again because you're trying to accumulate evidence. But what are you doing to the child? You're traumatizing them, exactly. You're forcing them to relive the trauma. You're forcing them to bring this out of their memory where they potentially have repressed it or they're in denial about this taking place. And now, of course, you've traumatized the child and potentially you're doing damage to the child, but potentially for the rest of their lives. So this is probably not the best idea in the whole wide world. This is known as the reminiscence effect, and it can explain why multiple interviews might be useful. They will get things confused. You'll say, well, just before Christmas, your uncle came over and he did what? And of course, since your uncle has been over multiple times, since the uncle has been over multiple times, potentially they're getting different pieces of information confused with other pieces of information. But of course, as a prosecutor, you have to pin all this down. Because if it can be refuted by the defense attorney, then the individual may get off without anything happening to him. So you've got to pin all this information down. A 14-year-old girl informed her mother that her mother's former partner had sexually assaulted her. There was evidence that the young girl was telling the truth. An interview with the girl using open-ended questions disclosed 3 separate episodes of abuse. A second interview disclosed another episode and more corroborating details. And this is actually a 14-year-old. Why she's making that fish face, I have no idea. It's just what people do on selfies. Don't they? Isn't that what they do on selfies? They make fish faces. This is a 14-year-old girl. I typed in there 14-year-old girl and this picture came up. Repeated interviewing is necessary when an alleged victim is too distressed to provide useful information. Initially, when victims fail to disclose abuse that is later documented by medical examinations or suspect confessions, or when other new evidence comes to light, and of course, they are so traumatized a lot of times that we don't get very good information. Initially, if we come back to the individual, then potentially we can get better information. Especially if we find out, yes, obviously this individual, their hymen is broken, they're only 10 years old. Well, this girl's another 14-year-old, by the way. Eventually, of course, you're going to get good information. But you have to interview them over and over and over again in order to get this information. If they're old enough, of course, they can deal with the trauma. If they're too young, then potentially all you're doing is re-traumatizing the child. But of course, there's no way to get the man to stop, to prosecute this guy and get him out of the house unless we get this information. I know, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You're in between a rock and a hard place, and you certainly want the abuse to stop. And you want the guy to be punished for doing what he's done. We need to tell people that he is potentially a serial rapist or a pedophile. We need him to go on a registry so that people are aware of who he is, so that he can't do it again. Does that make sense? This is a tough one. This is really tough and very, very painful. I was living in Iowa, and they discovered that there was a trailer park in Rock Island, which is the Quad Cities. So it's one of the Quad Cities. In one of the Quad Cities. And Rock Island, they had this trailer park. And in this trailer park, all of these guys that were on the sexual registry were all living at this one trailer park. I know. Nobody noticed it. It was really kind of odd. Every time somebody who's on this list of sexual predators, they have to inform people that they are moving. They have to inform the police. And then the police will put it in the newspaper, and then everybody knows where this guy is. He's at 555 Johnson Boulevard or whatever. All of these guys, so they had like 5 of them. There were 5 guys living in this one trailer park. And guess what they were doing? They were all pedophiles, and guess what they were doing at the trailer park? What a surprise. I know. Okay, so they had, and one of these guys had been there for like 5 or 6 years, and he had invited his friends over, and some of them were living with him, and some of them were living next door. Well, of course, he was molesting the children in the trailer park, and this had been going on for 5 years. And in one case, he was the boyfriend of a mother, and the mother was allowing him to molest her children. She had 3 daughters, and she was allowing him to molest the 3 children. And it got, okay, so all of a sudden somebody started looking, and somebody realized what the hell was going on in Rock Island. And so they identified this place as a predator's hangout. And then they went to some of the children, and some of the children didn't disclose any information, and other children did, and they worked up a whole case against the mothers, and they were allowing this guy to babysit their children, because he was her boyfriend. So he was, yeah, okay. Anyway, so the whole thing blew up. It was in the paper for months. They convicted the mother of I don't know. They convicted her, and she's gone to jail for about 15 years or something. They took all the children out of the trailer park, and they sent them all to therapy just in case they'd been molested. I mean, it was a really, really horrible, horrible situation. But and nobody cared because this was outside of Rock Island, so the police from Rock Island didn't care. So it was the sheriff's department's responsibility, but nobody had informed the sheriff's department of what was going on. So anyway, this whole thing had been going on for 5 years. Ugly, ugly, ugly situation. And this thing just blew up a couple weeks ago. They put the guy that was the initial predator, they put him in jail for life. He's in jail for life in Illinois, which means he'll probably be out in 5 or 6 years. Illinois, they don't have enough money. They don't have any money. They're like $15 billion in debt or something. So they're going to have to close all the prisons and release all the pedophiles. It's horrible. Anyway, just offended. She's going to leave me here. Children are sometimes reluctant to disclose abusive experiences and may even deny them when asked, of course. And this is part of what was going on. One of the little girls broke her leg. When she broke her leg, they went in. She went to the emergency room. They noticed she had a rash that ran up her leg. They asked her what the problem was. She denied that there was a problem. The mother's wouldn't allow them to inspect what was going on. The doctor, the emergency room doctor, decided that it looked like she'd been sexually abused, and because of that, he petitioned the court to just inspect the child Of course, she's gone home by this time, and it was a couple days later before they got the subpoena. So the subpoena, she came in, they inspected her, found out she'd been sexually molested. She was suffering from gonorrhea and chlamydia. Oh, just two sexually transmitted diseases. Anyway, that's where her rash came from, and that's what blew the whole thing up. This little girl broke her leg. Later, it was the mother she came in again, and she had bruises on various places in her body. They had beaten her because she broke her leg and because of all this information that she didn't disclose any information, but because of her, the whole thing blew up after that. And of course, they took her away from the mother, and there was a big court fight about taking a child away from her mother. It was a little girl. She had 3 daughters. It was the youngest. Research does suggest that many children can remember significant details of abuse experiences, and if asked directly, can describe them quite accurately. So children can usually describe them fairly well. These are adult things that are happening to them. Because they're adult things, they tend to remember them better. They're not playing some strange game that they can't remember. A subgroup of abuse victims either forgets about abuse or remembers it poorly. The question is, why do they forget this? People who cope with maltreatment by trying to suppress, inhibit, or ignore their thoughts about it may weaken or even eliminate memories of these experiences over time. And this is what most children will do. They will forget it. There was a case of they found a tape out in the desert. This is Las Vegas, and I know we just had this horrible trauma in Las Vegas, but this was something that happened in Las Vegas. And they found a tape out in the desert, and somebody popped it in a VCR. Turned out it was a sex tape of a man having sex with an 18-month-old child. Well, they couldn't identify, they didn't see any faces, they didn't see the little girl's face, they didn't see the man's face, but they were able to identify the little girl by the clothes that she was wearing. It was Walmart clothes, and this had only come out for 2 weeks in the summertime, and so they identified it by the color of the clothes. They finally identified the little girl. They went to the mother's house, and they said, "We think that your daughter has been molested." And she said, no, that couldn't possibly be true. Couldn't possibly be true. Well, has she been out of your sight? And she said, yeah, I sometimes let my neighbor babysit my child. He is my boyfriend, and he's also my neighbor. And as it turned out, that's what was happening. He was, when he was babysitting, he was molesting the child, taping it, and then selling the tapes. So she was only 18 months old when she was molested. By the time they discovered all this stuff, she was like 3 years old. So they interviewed her to find out how much damage had been done psychologically to the little girl. Didn't remember anything about the abuse, had no memory of it whatsoever. She was only 18 months old. So she didn't have any verbal skills. Since she didn't have any verbal skills, she had no way of thinking about this thing that had happened to her. And she was only 18 months old. And usually at that age, our memories are very inaccurate and incomplete anyway. And of course, she had no way of remembering any of this stuff. Uh-oh. What'd I do? You're coming in for something. Repossess. You're repossessing me. Oh, this is Mrs. Haskey's thing. I don't have to go downstairs. Okay, you've taken care of that. Do I need to lock the video?
All right then.
Okay, thank you so much. Francis, you're a hero. Thank you. Anyway, okay, so the good news is the little girl didn't remember anything. The other good news is they caught the guy when he discovered that they were looking for him. He took off in his car, and they caught him in Mississippi. So he went all the way from Las Vegas to Mississippi before they caught him. They had an all points bulletin out for this guy, and they caught him in Mississippi. And now they've thrown him in jail for a couple of weeks or whatever. Probably out by this time. Anyway. Okay, all kinds of interesting things happen. So a lot of children repress these ideas, they suppress them, they ignore these thoughts. Sometimes they don't have the intellectual capacity to remember this stuff. And that's the good news. So a lot of times if this happens early enough in their childhood, they won't remember it at all. Potentially. So there you go. I mean, if you think back, what is your earliest memory? Probably you can remember things maybe when you were 3, maybe when you were 2.5, but not when you were a year and a half. You don't remember being born. If you do, you just think you do. You don't really remember being born, certainly. Okay. Anyway, most kids can't remember these things. So that's the good news. Okay, why don't we stop right here? Let's stop right here. I'm sorry that this was such a